dialogue today to talk about Invisible Wounds, the emotional journey of a police officer's battle with PTSD. And I had the pleasure to talk with both your wife Sandra and your son Sean, and it really was terrific for me to get another perspective and to talk to family members about your book, about their experiences and their thoughts. And I sort of like to take this opportunity to follow up a little bit on some of the things that we discussed and to talk more specifically around the impact that your journey has had on family members, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure. And glad to be back, Rick.
Okay, terrific. When we talked when I spoke with Sandra, with Sean, it was interesting because they were really able to uncover some thoughts they had about how over the years, what essentially I guess you were doing was, for want of a better word, sheltering them from your experiences, sheltering them from those very traumatic experiences that you described very well in your book, and the struggles that you were facing personally, and why you weren't really always yourself. Those were the three things that we focused on. And it was very obvious to me from my discussions with them that, in fact, you had come up with your own methodology and your own approach in sheltering them. So I wondered if we could explore that a little bit further from your perspective. Was that the case? And were you, over the years, keeping things, I don't mean in a negative way, but were you keeping things so that they weren't impacted the same way you were impacted? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. It's very interesting question. It's something that I had discussed actually with my family afterwards, once I started to be more in the healing stages. Um, I'm not sure. This is how I'm going to answer it. I'm not sure if I did it consciously
Okay.
to shelter them. I think it's a combination of, what am I going to tell them? This person, I'm not going to go into details, but, this person committed suicide and blah, blah, blah. This was the scene, blah, blah, blah. Unlike with the other police officers you're working with, they actually see the same thing as you are at the moment. So, afterwards you can talk to them without using a lot of words, without using the really gross part of it, if you want to call it that. If,
Sure.
let's say, somebody shot themselves in the head, well, it's not a pretty sight. Well, we kind of understood each other, but I think there's another aspect to it as well, is that as police officers, when you're working in an environment that is highly violent or highly active, if I can use that word, as it was where I work, is you become very good at detaching yourself from reality. Because I think, from what my psychological sessions that I've had, and I'm still having some, and from the reading that I've done, from researching, trying to understand myself, is that the way I see it is that the mind in itself is, when you're always looking at traumatic event, when your mind is always active to be on alert, when your mind is always active and scanning and all that, it becomes very, very tired. And I think when I got home, the last thing I wanted to do was talk about all those things that were going on in my head, which in reality was probably not a good thing, because when I reflect back on it, is that you detach yourself from your family. So there's no more connection there. And I would say that is where, at that point, that I started to become emotionally numb as well.
Okay.
And the feelings were not there as much. And that would actually, and I don't blame my wife on this, but at the time it kind of would irritate me. But now I understand what the reason was, is that she really didn't like the fact that that when other police officers would come to see me at my house, then all of a sudden everything would pop up. Oh, you remember this, blah, 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 and all that. And she would tell me after, I said, how come you're talking? How come you don't tell me these stories? Well, I didn't have an answer. So I think it's a combination of not telling them really about all of that, what's going on, and also the detachment itself, becoming emotionally numb. Not really. I think the mind, once it was home, is almost like a safe haven for me, or for my mind. So I just wanted to decompress and just be left alone.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to talk about that anymore.
Yeah, you described that interesting that you described that as a detachment because you detached for your reasons that you just described really well. But I guess there'd always be the worry on Sandra's part that you were detaching for another reason or that you didn't want to talk to her or you didn't trust her, maybe. I wonder, is that possibly
Mm.
something that would have, or would that be
There, I
the
mean,
case?
yeah, I mean, there is something in the police world where you become very suspicious of everything around you. It's a, how can I say this? It's almost like it's going to happen. You
Yeah.
can't avoid that.
Okay.
You get lied to, you get tricked into certain situations. So after a while, the mind, you see, you have to understand that the mind doesn't realize this is family. This is, uh,
Hmm.
you know, uh, a stranger. The mind just sees a human being in front. The rest
Sure.
of our emotions come in to enter, and then, oh, I know Rick, I know my wife, I know Sean, I know Benoit. I think I'm trying to explain that the best that I can, but I don't think I did that purposely. I don't think that I didn't trust my wife, although
Yeah.
sometimes I would say that please don't repeat this to anybody.
Sure.
I wouldn't name names or anything like that. Like I wouldn't say, well, Joe Blow did this, but I would say this is what happened. But after a while, I guess I just shut down. I think my whole mind was just shut down. I don't think it had anything to do with my wife or my sons or anything like that. I think
Sure.
it was just a job, and it was me not processing everything properly. As a
Yeah.
matter of fact, I wasn't processing anything at all, except when I saw my buddies. But it was so busy where I worked in Rishabako that yeah, we did have some fun once in a while and joke around between us to kind of relieve the stress. But
Mhm.
overall, it was a fairly busy area. And when calls weren't coming in, you were kind of like, kind of a, I guess, a underline or a, how do you say that? Not underline, but kind of, yeah, it was kind of underlying policy, I guess, that, you know what, if there's no calls coming in, you're out there in the back rows checking cars, you're doing this, you're checking this. So
Mhm.
Rishabaka had a reputation of that, that we
Okay.
were always doing something. We weren't just sitting there in the office and not doing anything because calls were not coming in. We are very, actually very proactive in Rishabaka, at least when I started there.
Sure.
So yeah, I guess, I don't know. I wish I could answer it better than that, but
No, it's
it's,
a good
it's,
answer. I
yeah,
understand exactly where you're coming from. And I guess even for you to acknowledge the struggles you were facing, because as you said in previous dialogues, previous discussions, you hadn't come face to face with the struggles you were facing for quite a while. So for you to discuss that and to openly say what the impact is on you when you hadn't really faced the impact, perhaps, you know, I hope
yeah,
I'm describing
yeah.
that well. So how can you really say to your spouse or your children, this is what how I'm being impacted when you haven't really faced it yourself, perhaps? Was that the case?
Very possible because you bring up a good point because I remember like in those days I really struggled to even understand myself,
Sure.
let alone, I mean, when I'll tell you a little bit of a story here, and I don't know if I did in the other podcast or not, but I know I think it's written in the book, but I'm not sure. But the first time I took that first step to go
Hmm.
see a psychologist was when I was in the Yukon,
Hmm.
and I went to see a psychologist in Whitehorse my first time. I couldn't remember because I think it was I think the stress was there. It's like, how are you feeling today? And I didn't know what to answer, and I had to protect that image that I could take it and all that because I went backwards. And when I retired, my last session with that same psychologist, she was kind of sad to see me because she kind of liked having me as a client and all that. But she asked me. She said, "Do you remember the first time that you came to my office? What you said, the first thing you said?" And I said, "I don't remember." And can you believe it? The first thing I said is that I've never seen one of you guys before. And she said, "I interpret it because you emphasized the you." So she said, "I'm on the outside. You're like this is your wall. This is your space. I'm on the outside. That's you. So I
Sure.
haven't seen any one of you guys before." And then she went on, and I kind of laughed a little bit. I said, "Yeah, probably." I'm not going to argue that. And then she said, "You know what? The second thing you told me?" I said, "No, I don't." She said, "As you were sitting down, you said, and if you think you're going to put me off work if I open up, then I'm out the door right now. So I wasn't even ready at that time. It took me quite a while before I actually started opening up. And to
Mm.
be honest, when I first started opening up, I remember call because of course my psychologist was in Whitehorse. I was 5 hours away. My home, my residence was 5 hours away up north in Beaver Creek. And I forgot where I was going with this. My train of thought. Help me out there, Rick.
No, in terms of how you responded to what she said about,
Oh
uh,
yes, and I
yeah.
remember like so after each session, because I would drive down from Beaver Creek like in the afternoon, like noon, let's say, and have
Mhm.
an appointment of an hour and a half in the afternoon, sleep over in Whitehorse, and then have another one in the morning. Well, the one in the afternoon, once I was done, I would always call my wife, and I remember vividly actually going on dirt roads off just outside of Whitehorse and just talking to my wife, and I was basically crying and discouraged, going like, it feels like when I'm talking to her and I want to open up, everything's all mixed up. I'm all over the map, which now I know it's very, very common because everything that I had stuffed down for all those years was like a big ball of yarn, mixed up
Yeah.
yarn. And when
Mhm.
you pull on the string, we all know what happens. Other string follows, and then you're trying to, and basically it's still happening now because,
Yeah.
for example, you just saw an example there, and I didn't do this on purpose,
Mhm.
but I might be talking, and all of a sudden it's like something else pops up in my mind, and I lose my train of thought. And a couple of years ago, that would frustrate the hell out of me.
Mhm.
Now I've learned to accept it because that's my reality today.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's, I don't know if that relates a little bit to the
Yeah.
question you're asking, but it's
Yeah.
just to show you, I guess, and show the viewers at what point where I was in my, like, the state of my mind at that time. And I was like before Rishabh. I mean, that was after Rishabh. And Rishabh,
Mm.
I had spent a good, I would say, a good 10 to 12 years in that state.
Wow.
So
Just to follow up on that, and when you did have that opportunity to talk to Sandra after those appointments, and you said that you showed some emotion and you were all over the place. I can't remember the exact words you just said, but that you had a chance to actually dialogue with her about that. Do you think it made her feel more connected then when she was hearing how you were dealing with it?
I can't answer for her, but I think that's the kind of like the turning point
Mm,
where the connection started to start again,
okay.
because that connection was lost. I'm very blessed, if I can use that word, that she still stuck around. It's like my psychologist in Whitehorse said, you must have been a really, not that she was saying that I was being a like
Mhm.
an asshole now, but she said like the reason why she's still sticking around is a reason, or a reason could be because pre PTSD, uh, I was good to her. Like she felt like I was a good match for her.
Yeah.
So in other words, the jar, the good jar, was being filled up, and there was nothing in the bad jar. And then by the time the bad jar started to, I guess, to fill up before
Mhm.
it broke, I went and saw a psychologist. I guess if I can
Okay.
explain it that way.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, and you describe it in a very similar format in your book. So that's I understand that completely. One of the things I chatted with your son Sean about, it was towards the end of our dialogue, was if he'd ever considered himself following in your footsteps and becoming a police officer. And really interesting response because, of course, he had given that some consideration, as you know. How would you, if the decision had been made for Sean or for your other son to become a police officer, how do you think you would have responded to that if he came definitively to you and said, Dad, I've decided I'm going to do this? How would you respond?
We actually, it's kind of funny in a way, because we actually had that discussion, me and Sean, when we were actually in Beaver Creek.
Okay.
And he was talking about it, and I said, you know what, I'll never tell you no, I'll never tell you yes, but if you're seriously thinking before you actually go and say, I'm going to fill out that application, you and me are going to have a sit down and have a really, really serious talk. And I was going to be, because at the time also when this happened, I was starting to open up because I was seeing a psychologist, so I was a little bit better equipped, I guess.
Okay.
But I was going to tell him exactly the way it is. I wasn't going to butter it up. I wasn't going to put any flowers over it. It was
Okay.
going, this is exactly what it is. So for you to survive, I was going to tell him, you have to see a psychologist at least use your 6 1-hour sessions every year. Use them up. Because if you happen to be in a traumatic incident, they will have psychologists for you outside of those 6 hours that they're, giving you as a benefit. That was going to be my message to him.
Sure.
I
Yeah. And I
wasn't
think
going to
you,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I think you once said to me that you had that opportunity, of course, for those 6 hours every year for years and years. But I can't recall the exact number of years. I think it was like 22, 23 years. You said you never ever availed of that,
Mhm.
correct?
So I had 24 years when I saw the psychologist in Whitehorse, which was the first time. I had 2 psychologists come up in Rishabakto after like pretty traumatic incidents that had happened, and it was
Mhm.
part of my shift. And the 2 times, one time I was a constable, the other time I was a corporal. And as a constable, I didn't like the way it was done because everybody was in a circle, including like the officers, like the ones in charge and all that, even though they weren't part of that scene itself. I guess they wanted to be there, see how it runs or whatever. I don't know. But I didn't feel like I wanted to speak up. I didn't at the time too, when this started, I had probably a lot of baggage, and I had built up quite thick walls to protect them. So no, that didn't go too well. And the second time was later down the road, which I was even more, I guess if I had a bigger fortress, I guess if you want to call it that, or a thicker fortress to crack. And she came into my office. I was a corporal. I had an office, and she came to my office, says, I'm here if you want to, talk about it, this and that. And I looked at her, and my response was basically, you know what? I've seen these types of accidents or these types of scenes many, many times. I've dealt with it my own way, so I'm okay. Don't worry about me. And then she just left, which was the furthest from the truth. That was just a macho,
Yeah.
I don't need anybody else to figure me out, and see you later. I don't,
Yeah.
in other words, like we use all sorts of words. I don't want to see no quack. I don't want to see no, loony doctors or whatever the
Sure.
case may be,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
now I know it's not even close to that. It's actually just having somebody to talk to that offers you no judgment, and you know that they won't give you any judgment. So it's a safe environment for you to open up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think that do you think that the police force and maybe even other first responders should have something available in terms of professional support for family members? Should there be an opportunity for family members to share their concerns, their worries? At one point, Sandra said, she worried every time the phone would ring. And I certainly can understand that. If you're married to a police officer and the phone rings in the middle of the night,
Mhm.
it might be you or it might be somebody calling to
Mhm.
tell her that something happened to you. Of course, that's
Yeah.
very worrisome.
Yeah.
Should there be
Yeah.
support? Should there be some structure there for?
I think I think there is support there. When I joined in '87, of course, I don't remember having anything like that. But of
Okay.
course, I was single. I was single back then. I wasn't married, so obviously they wouldn't have approached me for that service, even if they had it. But I don't remember hearing about it until later down in my career. And they did have it, but it was the same as our programs for mental health. So they're there.
Oh,
If you feel
okay.
like you need to reach out, reach out. Um, I think there should be something as well, like there should be two types of presentation given. That's my opinion. One for married members that are in training. There should be also at the end of the training, there should be all the wives and the girlfriends should be attending this presentation. And this is what you can expect. And if there's training members that have kids, the same thing, unless they're kids like 1 or 2 years old that can't understand. But if they're at an age that they can actually understand, then they should take part of that.
Mhm.
And for single police officers that eventually get married, then it could be, I wouldn't call it mandatory, but you know what? We're given this presentation. You should attend. If you don't want to attend, you can't force everybody to attend, but
Mhm.
I think it should be really offered in a way, I guess, and if I can say it like physically,
Mhm.
this is available. We want you here, like
Yeah.
make you feel part of the family.
Yeah.
Not just, hey, there's a program there if you want to check it out.
Yeah.
That's my thought. I think people would be more tempted to participate in that.
Do you think that a reference or a reading resource, like your book, for example, Invisible Wounds,
Mhm.
Do you think that'd be a good way to orient or to introduce this topic to new recruits or people that are new in the police force? Reading your book, hearing your experiences, learning what you learned after many years.
I think my book would, I think would help greatly. That no doubt about it. I have a lot of confidence in my book. There's also another book there by Dr. Gilmartin.
Okay.
Um, but he's an ex police officer, but went and got his psychology degree.
Okay.
So now that's what he does. He's a psychologist, but he wrote a book. It's not a very thick book, but I read it. I personally read it. It's very, very good. If you want to learn both, like for on my side, the experience side of it, and then Gilmartin, because he's got a police background, he actually explains the medical side of it really, really well. I
Okay.
really enjoyed it. And the person that referred that to me was a member I supervised in the Yukon while I was in the Yukon, but he had read it when his father was an RCMP and he was a son of an RCMP. So
Okay.
before he joined the RCMP, so and he actually referred it to me, and I actually thanked him for that because it actually was actually a really good book. So when you compare the two, you can kind of see like on the medical, the psychological part of it from a medical expert or a medical
Mhm.
practitioner, and then you have my experiences of what really goes through my mind and probably a lot of first responders' minds as well. So you can have kind of the best of both worlds, the
Yeah.
way I see it.
Yeah. Would you ever be receptive to the opportunity to speak to groups, to speak to police officers about your book and about your experiences?
Absolutely. I'm actually working now with Joel Grondin
Mhm.
and to work up for a presentation just to prepare myself. That's just who I am. I like to
Sure.
prepare myself before. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. No big deal. But if it does, at least I'll have something ready and I won't have to say, "Oh, I can't make it until another 2 months because I have to prepare my
Yeah.
presentation." I can say,
Yeah.
"Yeah, I can be there like next weekend or in 2 weekends, or I've got
Terrific.
something prepared already." Yeah, so I'm actually in the works now of doing that. So absolutely, I would definitely
Great.
enjoy doing that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Um, I sort of want to take you back to, and we're going back a few years, Norm. I hope you don't mind. Take you back to your training process, which of course
Sure.
happened in Regina back in well, what 1982,
87.
84? Oh, I'm
87.
sorry, excuse me,
Yep.
87.
Mhm.
So at that time, was there anything at all in the training material? Because I'm sure it's a very extensive training process. I've known a few people that have gone through it. Was there anything at all about the emotional impact, the trauma, the resulting impact it could have on an individual? Was there anything around the psychology topic that was introduced to you back then?
There wasn't. I can't say that there was. I can't remember in 87 any of the instructors talking about mental health and the impact and all that. They do
Okay.
say that certain scenes, they warn you that certain scenes are probably going to be pretty gruesome.
Yeah.
But I think the mental health issues was, excuse me, was more like for veterans from wars and that,
Okay.
because the PTSD term was coined with the Vietnam War vets, and then they kind of trace it back to Korean War and then the World War II, World War I, and the wars before that. Of course, they had other names for it back then, but the term PTSD was military.
Okay.
We're not supposed to have that in the police. We're just human beings with a uniform, and after we take the uniform off, we're just normal like everybody else. And in a sense,
Okay.
it is. And in a sense, it is. We're all the same humans, but the impact on mental health takes a toll after you've worked so many years as a police officer. Now, I base that on my RCMP experience. I can't talk about other agencies training as well, so it's specifically RCMP. And I have to say also, I don't think it's because the RCMP were like, no, no, we don't need that. I just think it wasn't really talked about within the police world. So I think it was just an unknown, and I think everybody kept to themselves when things were going the way it was going for me in the dark hole. And open up a bottle of beer or open up a bottle of whiskey and drink yourself to sleep, and the next morning forget about it and move on.
Hmm.
And especially like in areas like Rishabukta, where you always, like I said, on average you might get like 2, 3, 4 calls an hour on a shift, and not all are violent, but I mean it's still like busy. You have to run here, run there. and it gets, I mean, it takes a heavy toll on you after a
Mm.
while. And so, yeah, I, I guess I'll leave it at that. But it's I don't know if I answered all of your question. If
Yeah.
not, just ask it again. And
No, no, you certainly did answer the question. Do you know if now they're looking more at that type of thing in the training process, or are you aware of that?
uh, I'm not 100% aware, but I know a member that I had worked with years back that I still, go see once in a while for coffee. He had actually sent me an email on this presentation done, and I actually had attended the presentation. I was kind of curious, and that's what it was. It was like for family members, RCMP members could take part as well, but it was more geared towards the families.
Yeah.
Well, believe it or not, I think besides me and the other police officer, there might have been maybe 4 or 5. That's it. And this was like specifically for the Kodiak detachment, which I think they must be 120, 130 total
Mhm. Mhm.
of employees. So it's pretty disappointing. So that's why I'm saying like it needs to be, they need to do something a little bit better or more. How can I say this? I guess more family friendly, maybe.
Mm.
And of course, now we're talking about COVID, so it's kind of maybe might be that as well. It could be the difficulty of sitting in front of a screen and just listening to somebody talk instead of
Mm.
being present in a room and having other people interact with other people. I
Sure.
don't know. Maybe that had something to do with that, but
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like there's certainly an opportunity there for discussion and openness. And the family, we focused in this discussion on the impact on family and incorporating family in some way. Just to wrap up, I wonder if I could ask you, I hope this isn't too challenging a question, but to ask you if you would do anything differently. If you look back on how you, and I'm focusing specifically on the family interaction, if you look back on how you would have dealt with your family, with your spouse, with your sons, would you have changed anything? Would you have talked more openly? Would you have brought it up earlier than you did if you were to have your time over to do it again?
I would recommend that 100% to any police officer that works but
Okay.
again, I wouldn't say, honey, I went to this scene and brain were all over the ceilings and this and blah,
Mm.
blah, blah. But you can actually get, you know, I guess the stressors out without going into details. Honey, I
Yes.
went to the suicide call. It was very gross, very
Mm.
gruesome, and I'd like to talk about it.
Mhm.
And then that would have kept that. And if you keep doing that, of course, you get better and better at opening up. Like I am today, the way I'm talking, even in these podcasts, turn back the clock 2 years. There's no, maybe 3 years now, but 3 years ago, I don't think I would have been able to do it like publicly like
Yeah.
this.
Okay.
Um, so it takes quite a while to open up, but it only took me that long because I had so much baggage stuffed in there. And
Mhm.
that's why I really do believe, and I truly believe, that if you process your trauma on a regular basis, whether it's with your wife, whether it's with a psychologist, I would recommend a mental health professional. But as long as it's being processed, that it's being thrown out there.
Mhm.
And I think personally, I think that you're in a better place when you go home. You feel safe. You don't start to feel suspicious that if I tell that to my wife, she might think this, or she
Mhm.
might think I'm not as strong mentally, and then she might say, "Oh, well, maybe you should leave the police force." Or see, and that goes into your mind all the time. And I'm saying those words because they're popping up in my head because those are words that probably were popping up in my head way back then.
Mhm.
But I would definitely recommend, and even if you don't, to me, I think if you're married, if you want to keep that relationship going strong, you have no choice but to open up. Not everybody, I'm very, very lucky to have a wife like I had, because I always told my wife after I started to be better is uh, any other woman, I think she would have left me a long time ago. So I'll leave it
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. It's been really interesting to take a different slant on our dialogue, our discussion this time, and to talk about the impact on family as a follow up to that session and that dialogue with your wife, Sandra, with your son, Sean. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. And it brings a different flavor to our dialogue. And I look forward to our next discussion. So thanks again for joining me, Nora.
Thanks for having me, Rick.
All right, so long.